Hey guys, today is your last day of school. It is crazy. Cannot believe how fast this has went the last 6 weeks. And those of you who were on the Zoom last night know how sad I was that I had to say goodbye on Zoom, and I really hope and pray that we can have some type of party this summer. But if we don't, just know that I love you guys so much and that you guys are the best class I've ever had. And I'm not just saying that, you really are. And I'm not sure how next year's gonna top it, because you guys are my kids. You guys know, you guys said I was your school mom, and that's how I felt. I don't have kids of my own, and so you guys have my heart forever, not just this year. So please make sure you guys come back and visit me and stay in contact. I'm glad that I'm friends with like almost all the parents on Facebook, because I love seeing pictures of you guys and videos and things. It definitely helps. So today is May 15th, 2020, and today's the last day of your distant learning. So, fact or opinion for reading, get it done. I know some of you guys are already done, and congrats to you, that is awesome. But if you're not, just get done quickly this morning. I'm up earlier this morning. I'm going to be at the school even though it's pouring rain, but I got a new shirt, and I had signs that me and Miss Monroe are going to be holding, and so I'm going to be up at the school, probably under the shelter, but I decided to video this morning before I get soaking wet, because I'll be up there holding signs for your last day of school. So if you want to come by and wave and visit me, that'd be wonderful. I'm going to be up there from 9 to 10. So I'm trying to get this done before I go. So math, make your best paper airplane fly it 3 times and measure its distance. How can you change the plan to make it go further? Try it. Okay. Planets, learn about each planet in our solar system and try out the riddles. And there's a worksheet for that. Write at least 10 questions to interview a family member or friend. You can do it in person or on the phone. Okay. Gwen had this for 4th grade, and so she just went to her dad and was just asking, she asked about his childhood and what school was like for him. And this one's my very favorite. Last one. Specials. Dance party celebration. You have completed all the learning menus for the school year. Enjoy your summer. So, that's the end of it. I have 2 chapters to read, and I will be done with this book. Okay? Perfect timing. Chapter 11. Hook or me this time. Peter had sneaked through the jungle unseen. Midway to Kidd Creek, he passed the crocodile that, as always, was on Hook's trail. It was not ticking because the clock had run down. Peter grinned as a clever idea occurred to him. He imitated the ticking sound. It was perfect. Even the crocodile thought it was real and began to follow Peter. Peter swam easily across the open water to the ship. He scampered up his side, still ticking. It will be Hook or me this time, he thought, as he hoisted himself over the rail. The boys stood silently by so that they would not give him away. At that moment, the quartermaster came along the deck. Peter pushed him over the rail. One down, slightly whispered, and began to keep count. Captain Hook peered from his hiding place behind the ring of men. The ticking sound had stopped. He emerged as if he had not been scared out of his wits. His eyes glowed red, and his scowl turned sinister once more. "Get those boys to Johnny Plank," he ordered. He leaped onto the plank and began to dance along his precarious length. A devilish grin crossed his face as he sang, "Yo ho ho, the frisky plank. You walks along it so till it goes down and you goes down to Davy Jones below." Hook jumped to the deck, but first a bite of the whip for these prisoners, he said. "No," the boys shouted. Dukes, a pirate, hurried to the cabin to fetch the dreaded cat o' 9 tails. "Peter's in the cabin," slightly whispered to the cowering boys. A dreadful screech burst from the dark cabin. "What was that?" Hook cried. "2 down," Slightly said with a grin. Another pirate dashed into the cabin, but burst out a second later. "Duke is gone," he gasped. "There's something terrible in there." Hook eyed his men. "Get in there and see what it is," he hissed at Cecilia. He entered the cabin cautiously. Another horrible screech split in the air. 3, Slightly said. The pirate captain turned to Starkly. "I believe I heard you volunteer," he said. "No," Starkly said defiantly. "I won't go in there." "So it's mutiny, is it?" Hook growled. Starkly glanced at the ring of pirates gathered around Captain Hook. None of them moved, starkly eyed the dark cabin and then the cabin's gleaming iron hook. Neither choice looked good. He spun on his heels and leaped over the rail into the sea. 4, Slightly whispered to the other boys. Hook polished his claw against the coat. If one of you won't go, I'll fetch that cat myself, he said. He grabbed a flickering lantern and walked into the cabin door. Slightly pursed his lips, ready to count 5, but Hook staggered out before any damage was done. Something blew out the light, he muttered. Someone's aboard who doesn't belong, a pirate said. Maybe it's the devil. The ship is doomed, another cried. Hook touched his nose with the tip of his hook. Send the prisoners in, he said. If they beat what's in there, or it beats them, we'll be none the worse. The pirates shoved the boys into the cabin and slammed the door behind them. They turned away so they would not have to witness what was sure to follow. Inside the cabin, Peter unlocked the chains binding the boys. They all found weapons, and on Peter's hushed command, sneaked out the door unseen. Smart. Peter ran to Wendy and cut her bonds with his dagger. Now nothing prevented Peter and the children from flying to safety. But Peter's vow rang in his ear. Hook or me this time, he had said. They would fight to the finish. Peter wrapped Wendy's cloak around himself and put his back to the mast as Wendy hid in the darkness with the boys. Peter uttered a loud scream. The pirates were certain the noise signaled the end of the boys. They were panic-stricken. Whatever was in the cabin would surely come from them now. Hook sensed mutiny. He quickly turned to the mast. It's the girl, he snarked. A woman on a pirate ship brings bad luck. When she's gone, we'll get rid of what's in the cabin. He raised his clawed arm. Throw her overboard, he shouted. The pirates dashed for the cloaked figure at the mast. It was time for Peter to strike. He threw the cloak to the deck and brandished his dagger. Peter Pan! Hook screamed. At once, he and his men knew what it was that had lurked inside the cabin. His black heart thumped with fear, but the fight had gone out of him. Get him, he ordered, but his voice was weak. Attack, boys! Peter shouted to the children. They burst from their hiding place and went straight for the pirates. One by one, the pirates fell over or were tossed overboard. Slightly could scarcely keep count. The din of battle echoed over the water until at last only one pirate remained. The band of boys surrounded him with the gleaming swords high in the air. Put away your swords, boys, Peter shouted. He jumped into the circle to face Captain Hook alone. This one is mine, he said. Hook glared at Peter. Prepare to meet thy doom, he hissed. The pirate captain leaped at Peter with his hook and sword, slashing in the air. Peter quickly danced out of danger. He thrust with his own sword to nip Hook's coat. Hook nimbly escaped a more serious blow. He slashed back at Peter. Again, Peter parried the captain's attack. Again and again, the two exchanged strikes. Again and again, they avoided the worst. A sudden thrust by Peter sent Hook's sword flying to the deck. Disarmed, Hook was doomed, but Peter bowed graciously and allowed his evil foe to recover the fallen weapon. Hook was enraged by Peter's good form. Who are you? Captain Hook shouted, still fighting for his life. I'm joy and youth, Peter exclaimed, still pursuing his faltering prey. The two fought on, but Hook was clearly finished. In desperation, the pirate gave up the fight. He dashed into the power warehouse and lit the fuse of a powerful cannonball. The ship will be blown to pieces in 2 minutes, Hook crowed. He was desperately wanting to see Peter turn tail and flee for his life. Peter rushed into the warehouse. He grabbed the spinning bomb and hurled it overboard calmly as if it were a scrap of bread for a passing goal. Once more, Peter's good form got the better of Hook. Outfought and outwitted, Hook was beaten in every way. He staggered to the rail and climbed to its top. If he could not win, he could escape, even though it meant showing the worst form of all. With his black locks and long-tailed coat flying in the wind, Hook prepared to leap into the sea. He stared down at the dark water. A pair of eyes stared back. The crocodile snapped its powerful jaws. Hook shuddered. He turned his back to Peter. Peter stepped forward and with a swift kick sent Hook toppling into the sea. Bad form, Hook jeered as he vanished forever. The pirates were beaten. Peter and the boys raced a victory cheer as Wendy stepped out from the shadows. It's very late, she said, and time for bed. Without protest, the exhausted children lay down and soon were fast asleep. Chapter 12. So they beat Hook and he went in the water. They returned home. The pirate ship plowed through the sea with its crew of children and its captain, Peter Pan, at the helm. With luck, they would reach the Azores by the end of June. It would be easy to fly home from there. Wendy, John, and Michael had been gone for a very long time. They were eager to return and looked forward to the surprise on their mother's face. In the meantime, Mr. and Mrs. Darling waited. Mrs. Darling kept the nursery just as it was, although Nana's kennel was moved out between 9 and 6 o'clock. Mr. Darling felt it was his fault the children were gone, since it was he who had chained Nana in the yard that fateful night. He was so ashamed of his actions that he deferred to Nana and followed her wishes completely. To show his remorse, he stayed in the kennel and refused to come out. The first ones to reach the house at number 14 were Peter Pan and Tinker Bell. They flew to the open window. "Quick, Tink," Peter said. "Close the window and bar it. When Wendy returns, she'll think her mother does not want her back. Then she'll come back to Neverland with me." Peter had planned this trick all along. He did not want Wendy to return home at all. He flew to another window and glanced in. "It's Mrs. Darling," he exclaimed. The children's mother had fallen asleep at the piano. "She's pretty, but not as pretty as my mother," Peter said. Of course, Peter didn't know his own mother, even though he liked to say that he did. "You will never see Wendy again," he whispered. 2 fresh tears sparkled in Mrs. Darling's cheeks. Peter stared at them. "She is awfully fond of Wendy," he said. "She wants the window open so the children can come back. But then Wendy won't be able to stay with me. We can't both have her." He could not take his eyes off Mrs. Darling's sad face. "Oh, all right," he gulped. He quickly opened the nursery window. "Come on, Tink. We don't want any silly mothers." He turned his back to the window and flew away. Soon Wendy, John, and Michael reached the house. The window was opened for them after all. They flew inside and landed gently on the floor. Each looked around as if they had forgotten it was their home. "I think I've been here before," Michael said. "Of course you have, silly," John replied. "There's your bed, and there's the kennel. Maybe Nana is inside now," Michael exclaimed. Just then a noise from the hall warned the children that someone was coming. "It's Mother!" Wendy exclaimed. "Then you're not really our mother?" Michael asked in a sleepy voice. Wendy shook her head. She pointed to the beds. "Quickly," she said, "get in the bed if we've never been away." The children jumped into their beds and pulled up the covers. When Mrs. Darling peeked in the room, she saw at once that all the beds were full. She was sure she was dreaming. She sat down in her chair just as she had when they were babies. "Mother," Wendy cried. "That's Wendy," Mrs. Darling said. "Mother," John shouted. "That's John," Mrs. Darling said. "Mother," Michael crowed. "And that's Michael," Mrs. Darling said. Certain at last it was not a dream, she stretched out her arms for her children, who leaped out of bed and ran to her. "George, George," Mrs. Darling called to her husband. She wrapped her arms tightly around the children and held them very close. There never was a lovelier sight. Mr. Darling woke and came running with Nana close on his heels. Outside the window, a small face stared into the cozy room. It was the little boy whose life was filled with adventure and joy. But now, looking through the window, Peter Pan saw the one joy he would never, ever know. The Lost Boys were waiting outside. Wendy quickly explained to her mother that they would like to come in, too. Soon, Slightly, Toodles, Curly, Nibs, and the twins were in the children's room. They were still dressed in their pirate clothes. Each boy looked at Mrs. Darling's eyes as if to say, "May we please stay?" Mrs. Darling agreed immediately to let the boys stay, but Mr. Darling was not sure. After all, there were 6 of them, and the Darlings already had 3 children. "If we would be too much of a handful, we will go away," the first twin said. "We will share a bed," Nibs said. "I will cut their hair," Wendy said. "We'll fit in, sir," Toodles said. Mr. Darling nodded. "Yes," he said, "you can stay." "Hoopla!" the boys shouted, and they all danced through the house with joy. They finally had a real home. As for Peter, he saw Wendy one last time before returning to Neverland. He flew past the window and Wendy opened it to let him in. "Goodbye, Wendy," he said. "Are you really going?" Wendy asked. Mrs. Darling entered the room. She smiled at Peter and asked him to stay. "Would you send me to school?" Peter asked. "Of course," Mrs. Darling replied. "And I would have to grow up?" Peter asked. "Of course," Mrs. Darling replied. "I don't want to grow up," Peter said. "I'm going back to Neverland to live with Tink in a house in the trees." He glanced at Wendy. "It will be such fun," he said, hoping she would go with him. "May I go with Peter, Mother?" Wendy asked. "Of course not," Mrs. Darling said. "But he needs a mother," Wendy said. "And so do you," answered Mrs. Darling. "But you may visit Peter once each spring to help with his spring cleaning." Wendy agreed, though she would have preferred to go right then. She turned to Peter. You won't forget me, will you, Peter?" she asked. "Of course not," Peter promised, and then he flew away. Soon the Lost Boys were in school. Some did well, others had to struggle. After a time, they all forgot how to fly, even Michael. They no longer believed they could. Peter came for Wendy the next year, but she was surprised to learn that he had already forgotten many of their adventures together. He didn't even remember Captain Hook or Tinker Bell because his head was filled with new adventures. The next year, Wendy waited for Peter in vain. He did not come. Many more years passed, and Wendy was quite grown up. She didn't mind at all that she was grown. In fact, she liked it. Peter became a distant memory. The boys grew up too, and each went his own way in life, just as they should. Wendy married and had a daughter of her own named Jane, who was just as inquisitive as her mother. Jane loved to hear her mother tell of the boy who visited the nursery. Jane lived in the same nursery Wendy did when she was little. One night, after Wendy finished telling a story, Peter Pan himself flew through the window. He had no idea so many years had passed, for he was still a boy. Wendy felt strange because she was grown up, and Peter had not changed one bit. "Hello, Wendy," Peter said. "Hello, Peter," Wendy replied. Peter glanced around the room. "Where is John?" he asked. "And where is Michael?" "They aren't here anymore," Wendy said. "Have you forgotten that this is spring cleaning time?" Peter asked. "I can't go with you, Peter," Wendy said. "I've forgotten how to fly. I've grown up now." "I'll soon teach you again," Peter said. "Please, Peter, don't waste the fairy dust on me," Wendy replied. Peter was afraid for the first time in his life. "No," he said, but it was too late. The moment Wendy turned up the light, he saw she was a woman and not a little girl. Peter sat on the floor and began to cry. His sobs woke Jane. "Why are you crying, boy?" Jane asked. They were the very words Wendy first said to Peter many years before. Peter stood quickly and bowed very, very low. "My name is Peter Pan," he said. "Yes, I know," Jane said. "I've been waiting for you." When Wendy returned, she discovered Peter sitting on the bedpost and Jane flying around the room. "She is my mother," Peter said to Wendy. Wendy shook her head sadly. "Yes," she said. "Nobody knows that as well as I do." Peter flew into the air. "Goodbye, Wendy," he said. Jane flew to join him, and the two darted to the window. "No," Wendy shouted as she ran to the window. "It's just for spring cleaning time," Jane said to her mother. Wendy knew she could not hold them back. Peter flew out the window with Jane, trailing joyfully behind. "If only I could go with you," Wendy sighed. When Jane grew up, she also had a daughter. When spring cleaning came, she too flew off with Peter Pan to his mother. And so it will be forever as long as there are little children. The end. Such a good book. I have one thing, really quickly. Little visitor. Someone who wants to say goodbye. Mushu has missed you guys so much, and he would love for you guys to come back and visit. So, I think that's all I got for you, but it is summertime. So you guys enjoy your summer. You guys have worked so hard with distant learning, and I've been so proud of you guys. So have a great summer. Come back and visit. Love you guys.